Late August 1944. Northern France. The roads are no longer paved. They are scarred, cut deep by shell fire and summer heat. Dust hangs in the air, thick enough to coat lungs, uniforms, and engine blocks. Through that dust, engines growl, low, constant, unbroken. American trucks move through the darkness without headlights, one after another, mile after mile. Drivers grip the wheel with blistered hands, eyes burning from exhaustion. Some have been awake for more than 20 hours. They do not slow down. To the east, German commanders study their maps with confidence. They calculate fuel shortages. They measure distances. They assume the Americans must stop soon. No army can outrun its supply lines. Not this far, not this fast. They are wrong. What they cannot see are the roads behind the front, the endless convoys, the improvised system forcing fuel, ammunition, and food forward at a pace no European army has ever achieved. A logistical gamble built on engines, discipline, and human endurance. In the coming days, this unseen river of trucks will decide the fate of an entire campaign. And when it does, laughter inside German headquarters will turn into disbelief, then silence. Because the war is about to be decided not by tanks, but by fuel. June 6, 1944, had broken the seal of Fortress Europe. But it had not broken the war. When Allied troops came ashore in Normandy, they did so at the far edge of their logistical tether. Every rifle, every shell, every gallon of fuel had to cross the English Channel, land on contested beaches, and then be dragged inland through terrain deliberately ruined by German defenders. Victory on the sand did not mean mobility beyond it. By late June, the beachhead was secure but narrow. The hedgerows of Normandy turned every mile into a battle. Tanks stalled. Infantry bled for fields measured in yards. Behind the front, supply depots piled higher each day, yet nothing moved quickly. Roads were choked. Rail lines lay shattered by Allied bombing campaigns meant to cripple German movement, now haunting their own advance. The Allied logistical plan had assumed a methodical push inland. Ports would be captured, railroads repaired, supplies would flow forward in controlled stages, but the war refused to cooperate. Cherbourg fell on June 26, 1944, and with it came disappointment. German engineers had demolished the port before surrendering. Cranes were wrecked. Quays were mined. For weeks, Cherbourg could deliver only a fraction of what planners had promised. Meanwhile, the artificial Mulberry harbors, marvels of engineering, were battered by storms and overuse. At Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAEF, the arithmetic grew uncomfortable. More men were landing every week. More divisions were assembling. But the roads into France had not grown wider. They had grown worse. General Dwight D. Eisenhower understood the danger. Armies did not starve from lack of courage. They starved from lack of supply, and supply was already lagging. The German High Command saw this too. At least, they believed they did. From their perspective, the Allies were prisoners of their own success. An army that large could not move quickly across a devastated country. Fuel consumption alone made deep exploitation impossible. German doctrine had long emphasized that rapid advances collapsed under logistical weight. Blitzkrieg itself had taught them that. So they waited. In July, Operation Cobra shattered the hedgerow stalemate. American air power punched a hole west of St. Lo. Armored columns surged through the breach. Suddenly, the Allied advance was no longer measured in yards, but in miles. And with that success came a new problem. The faster the armies moved, the farther they outran their supply dumps. Fuel trucks were still traveling from beaches nearly 200 miles behind the front. Ammunition depots lagged even farther. Engineers worked miracles, but steel rails could not be repaired overnight. German commanders believed this was the moment the Allies would pause, regroup, rebuild logistics, restore order. They had seen it before, but they did not yet understand that the Americans were about to abandon order entirely and replace it with something far more dangerous, something improvised, something desperate, and something built on wheels. By mid-August 1944, the Allied advance had become a paradox. On the map, success was everywhere. Paris lay within reach. German units were retreating in disorder. Entire Wehrmacht formations were slipping eastward, abandoning equipment they could no longer fuel or repair. For the first time since 1940, Western Europe was opening. But behind the arrows and objectives, Allied headquarters faced a crisis that no victory could hide. Fuel. General George S. Patton's Third Army was advancing faster than anyone had planned for, faster than anyone had believed possible. His armored columns swept through Brittany, then pivoted east toward the Seine. His units were not being stopped by German resistance. They were being stopped by empty fuel tanks. Patton's doctrine was built on motion. He believed speed saved lives. Momentum shattered enemy morale. Stopping, even briefly, gave the enemy time to recover. Yet by August 19, his tanks were consuming fuel at a rate the supply system simply could not match. The numbers were unforgiving. A single U.S. armored division could burn more than 30,000 gallons of gasoline per day during sustained operations. Patton commanded multiple armored and infantry divisions, moving simultaneously across expanding fronts. Every mile forward increased the distance trucks had to travel from Normandy beaches, still serving as the primary supply entry points. Railroads were useless. Allied bombing had done its job too well. Bridges were down. Switching yards lay in ruins. Locomotives were destroyed or captured. The French rail network would take months to restore. Ports were no solution either. Cherbourg was still crippled. Antwerp, intact and capable of solving everything, remained in German hands until September. Until then, Normandy was all the Allies had. At Schaef, a quiet competition emerged. Montgomery's forces in the north demanded supplies for a push toward the Netherlands. Patton demanded fuel now, or risk losing the chance to destroy retreating German armies in the open. Eisenhower attempted balance, but balance did not move trucks any faster. German intelligence intercepted fragments of this struggle. They saw the bottlenecks. They knew the distances. To them, the conclusion was obvious. The Americans were overextended. Their advance would stall. It had to. Even within Allied command, skepticism lingered. The idea of sustaining an entire army group by trucks alone, over hundreds of miles of damaged roads, was considered reckless. No modern army had ever attempted it at this scale. Yet necessity left no alternatives. If the advance paused, German forces would regroup behind the Moselle and the Siegfried Line. The window to destroy them in retreat would close. Momentum would die. So logisticians began to plan something never written in any field manual. A system that ignored normal limits. A system that burned equipment to save time. A system that treated trucks like ammunition, consumed, not preserved. Its name would sound almost harmless. The Red Ball Express. And once it began, it would test not just machines, but the people driving them beyond human limits. Angle 1. The German view, why the Americans were expected to fail. From the German perspective, the Allied advance after Normandy violated every lesson of modern warfare. German staff officers had studied logistics with almost obsessive care. They understood tonnage tables, fuel curves, and the mathematics of distance. Blitzkrieg itself had only succeeded when supply could keep pace with armor. When it could not, advances collapsed, as they had in Russia. By August 1944, German commanders believed the Americans were repeating the same mistake. Their intelligence estimates focused on ports. Without deep-water facilities like Antwerp, the Allies were mathematically constrained. Beach landings could not sustain a pursuit across France. Trucks could not replace railroads. Roads would choke. Engines would fail. Men would break. To German planners, this was not hope, it was certainty. They observed American columns racing forward and assumed desperation rather than strength. Speed, they believed, masked fragility. Every mile gained only deepened the logistical trap. The belief spread through headquarters. Wait long enough and the Americans would stop themselves. This assumption shaped German decisions. Counterattacks were delayed. Defensive lines were thin. The retreat was conducted with the expectation that time, not force, would halt the enemy. It was a fatal miscalculation. Angle 2. The American truck driver, the human engine of the advance. The Red Ball Express did not begin with generals. It began with drivers. More than three-quarters of the men assigned to the convoys were African-American soldiers, serving in segregated transportation units. Many had been trained quickly. Few had combat experience. None were prepared for what lay ahead. They drove day and night. 12 hours became 18. 18 became 24. Military police enforced one-way traffic on designated routes, marked by red discs, the red balls that gave the system its name. Drivers were forbidden to stop unless their truck broke down or they were fired upon. They slept beside the road when they could. They ate cold rations behind the wheel. Accidents were common, so were breakdowns. The roads were cratered, narrow, and jammed with traffic. German aircraft and artillery still posed threats in some sectors. There were no medals for this work, no headlines, but every mile driven meant a tank could move. Every delivery meant a frontline unit could fight one more day. The war rolled forward on their exhaustion. Angle 3. The machine trucks pushed beyond design limits. The backbone of the Red Ball Express was the GMC CCKW-2, a half-ton truck. It was reliable, durable, simple, and never meant to be used like this. Trucks ran overloaded, often carrying double their rated capacity. Maintenance schedules were ignored, engines overheated, tires shredded. Spare parts vanished as fast as they arrived. Mechanics cannibalized broken vehicles to keep others moving. Fuel inefficiency was accepted as the price of speed. Trucks burned fuel to deliver fuel, an equation that horrified traditional logisticians, but doctrine had been abandoned. Only momentum mattered. Each convoy that reached the front bought time. And time, in August 1944, was the most valuable commodity on the continent. The system was ugly, wasteful, unsustainable. And yet it worked. But this was only half the story. Because the gamble was not just mechanical. It was strategic. Angle 4. Command decisions when doctrine was thrown away. The Red Ball Express existed because senior commanders allowed rules to be broken. At SHAEF, logisticians warned of consequences. Trucks would wear out faster than factories could replace them. Fuel losses would be enormous. Drivers would collapse from exhaustion. The system could not be sustained for long. Eisenhower listened and approved it anyway. This was not blind optimism. It was calculation. The Supreme Commander understood that the window of opportunity was brief. German forces were retreating in disorder. Their cohesion was fragile. If pressure was maintained, entire formations could be destroyed before reaching prepared defenses. So traditional supply discipline was sacrificed for operational speed. Military police were given unprecedented authority to control roads. Normal convoy regulations were ignored. Speed limits were lifted. Safety margins disappeared. The logistical system became a weapon used aggressively, recklessly, and deliberately. The decision represented a shift in American warfare. Industry and improvisation replacing textbook precision. Angle 5. Patton's dependence on speed, why fuel meant everything. No commander benefited more from the Red Ball Express than George S. Patton. Patton understood warfare as momentum. He believed hesitation was more dangerous than risk. His orders emphasized relentless advance, deep penetration, and psychological shock, but none of it mattered without gasoline. In August 1944, Patton was furious and afraid. Furious that his tanks were being rationed, afraid that stopping would allow the Germans to escape. His famous drive across France was not fueled by bravado, it was fueled by desperation. Every Red Ball convoy that reached Third Army headquarters translated directly into movement. Tank columns restarted, artillery rolled forward, infantry followed. The front bent, then broke. Patton's blitz was not an accident. It was the visible result of an invisible supply miracle. Angle 6. The moral angle, invisible soldiers of a visible victory. History remembers generals. It remembers tanks. It remembers maps covered in arrows. It rarely remembers drivers. The men of the Red Ball Express operated under constant pressure, minimal recognition, and institutional discrimination. They bore the physical cost of an advance celebrated as brilliance elsewhere. When trucks broke, drivers fixed them. When roads vanished, they found new ones. They were ordered not to stop, not to complain, not to fail. Their reward was anonymity. Yet without them, the advance would have stalled. The Germans would have regrouped. The war would have dragged on. The Red Ball Express revealed a truth modern warfare often hides. Victory depends as much on endurance as on firepower. And now, with fuel flowing again, the moment of decision approached. Because the trucks had done their job, and Patton was about to be unleashed. August 25, 1944. The system went live. Without ceremony, without speeches, and without any certainty it would work. The Red Ball Express began moving. Designated routes stretched from Normandy supply depots to forward distribution points near the front. Red circular markers, simple, unmistakable, lined the roads. Military police stood at every intersection, diverting all other traffic away. From that moment on, the roads belonged to the trucks. Convoys rolled day and night, headlights off, spacing tight. Drivers were ordered to maintain speed no matter what. Stopping was forbidden. If a truck broke down, it was pushed to the side and left behind. Another would take its place. The numbers escalated with stunning speed. Within days, nearly 6,000 vehicles were committed to the system. At its peak, the Red Ball Express delivered more than 12,000 tons of supplies per day, most of it fuel. Gasoline flowed forward in steel jerrycans stacked high, often leaking, soaking the wooden beds of trucks and the uniforms of the men riding them. It was dangerous. Fires broke out. Accidents killed drivers. Sleep deprivation blurred judgment, but the flow never stopped. German reconnaissance saw the movement but misunderstood it. They assumed it was temporary, an emergency measure that would burn itself out. No army, they believed, could sustain such waste. At the front, Patton felt the change almost immediately. Fuel shortages eased, rationing loosened. Orders that had been delayed were suddenly executed. Units that had been immobilized for days roared back to life. The Third Army began moving again, not cautiously but aggressively. Each mile gained deepened the gamble. Every extra gallon burned meant more trucks sacrificed, more engines destroyed. But with every passing hour, German forces retreated farther, faster, and in greater disorder. The Red Ball Express was no longer a logistical experiment. It was a race between machinery and exhaustion, between German recovery and American momentum. And as August turned toward September, the outcome of that race was about to reshape the entire Western Front. With fuel flowing again, the Third Army did not pause. It surged. By late August 1944, Patton's formations were advancing across France at a pace unseen since the opening weeks of the war. Armored columns bypassed strongpoints. Infantry followed along secondary roads. German rear guards dissolved before contact, retreating faster than orders could reach them. What made the advance shocking was not just speed, but continuity. There were no operational pauses, no days lost waiting for supply dumps to catch up. The Red Ball Express ensured that forward depots appeared almost as quickly as the front moved. Fuel trucks arrived at night. Tanks rolled at dawn. German commanders began to realize the mistake. Their calculations had assumed logistical collapse. Instead, they saw an army moving faster the farther it went. Reports described endless convoys behind American lines, roads filled with trucks instead of troops. The Americans were not outrunning their supplies. They were dragging them forward by force. By early September, Patton's spearheads approached the Moselle River. The distance from Normandy beaches now exceeded 300 miles. Under any previous model of warfare, this should have been impossible. Yet Third Army units were still advancing, still supplied, still aggressive. The psychological impact was decisive. German units retreating toward the West Wall found themselves pursued relentlessly. There was no time to dig in, no chance to reorganize. Equipment was abandoned not because of combat losses, but because fuel simply ran out. Ironically, the German army now suffered the very logistical failure it had predicted for its enemy. Patton's blitz did not destroy the Wehrmacht outright, but it shattered its rhythm. It denied the Germans the pause they needed to rebuild coherent defenses in central France, and it forced them back toward prepared positions sooner and weaker than planned. By mid-September, the limits of the Red Ball Express finally approached. Trucks were worn out. Drivers were exhausted. Antwerp was nearing capture, promising a return to sustainable logistics. But the damage was done. The window had closed. The Germans had laughed at American logistics. Now they were retreating from it. And the consequences of that miscalculation would echo far beyond the roads of France. The Red Ball Express did not end in triumph. It ended in exhaustion. By mid-September 1944, the system was showing signs of collapse. Trucks that had run almost continuously for weeks began to fail in large numbers. Engines seized. Axles snapped. Tires disintegrated faster than replacements could arrive. Maintenance units were overwhelmed, forced to choose which vehicles could be saved and which would be stripped for parts and abandoned. The human cost was just as severe. Drivers were physically depleted. Many had been operating on minimal sleep for weeks. Accidents increased sharply. Collisions on narrow roads, rollovers in ditches, fires caused by leaking fuel, all became routine hazards. Casualty figures among transportation units rose quietly, rarely reported beyond logistical summaries. Fuel efficiency had become irrelevant. In some cases, it took nearly a gallon of gasoline to deliver a gallon forward. Traditional logisticians cringed at the waste, but by then, the strategic purpose had already been fulfilled. The Red Ball Express was never meant to be permanent. It was a bridge, built out of engines and human endurance, between Normandy and the next phase of the campaign. That bridge was burning itself out as it was crossed. Commanders recognized the limits. Patton himself was forced to slow operations near the Moselle. Supply priorities shifted again. The race could not be sustained indefinitely. Yet even as the system faltered, its impact remained undeniable. Entire German formations had escaped destruction, but not reorganization. Their retreat had been chaotic. Equipment losses were immense. Morale was shaken. The Wehrmacht reached the German border battered and disordered, far sooner than expected. The Red Ball Express had traded machines for time. And in war, time often matters more than steel. But the story did not end with worn-out trucks. Because the campaign had changed how modern armies thought about logistics forever. As the Red Ball Express slowed, the Allied war machine did not stop. It adapted. By late September 1944, Antwerp had finally fallen into Allied hands, its port facilities largely intact. The Scheldt estuary would still take weeks of hard fighting to clear, but for the first time since Normandy, planners could see an end to emergency logistics. Rail repair units moved forward. Pipelines were extended. Order began to replace improvisation. The Red Ball routes were gradually dismantled. What replaced them was a more sustainable system, one informed by hard lessons paid for in broken engines and exhausted men. The Allies had learned that speed could be purchased, but only at tremendous cost. They had also learned that logistics could be used offensively, not merely in support. German commanders drew their own conclusions. Post-war interrogations and captured documents revealed deep shock at the scale of American logistical improvisation. German doctrine had never considered trucks a substitute for rail at this level. The assumption that supply limits would restrain the enemy had proven false, not because the limits did not exist, but because the Americans were willing to destroy their own equipment to buy time. This recognition shaped later German defensive planning. By the time of the Ardennes offensive in December, German commanders no longer underestimated American supply resilience. They overestimated it, planning an attack that depended on capturing Allied fuel, acknowledging that without it, nothing could move. The Red Ball Express was no longer running, but its consequences were everywhere. It had accelerated the Allied arrival at Germany's borders. It had denied the Wehrmacht a clean reset after Normandy, and it had demonstrated that industrial capacity, combined with human endurance, could bend the rules of warfare, briefly but decisively. The war moved on. New battles loomed. New systems replaced old ones. Yet the lesson remained. Modern war would not be won by courage alone. It would be won by whoever could move fastest and sustain that movement longest. And that understanding had been paid for on the roads of France. The story of the Red Ball Express is often invisible in history books, hidden behind headlines of armored breakthroughs and celebrated generals. Yet it offers a profound truth. Wars are won not only by courage or firepower, but by movement, endurance, and the relentless application of logistics. For 2 weeks in August and September 1944, a river of trucks carried the weight of an entire campaign. Human determination met mechanical limits. Exhaustion was currency. Fuel was the lifeblood of strategy. American drivers, mostly young, often overlooked, and frequently segregated, became the unseen engine of Patton's advance. They transformed a desperate gamble into a strategic triumph. The Germans had laughed at U.S. logistics, confident that an army could never outrun its supply lines. Their error was in underestimating improvisation, industrial capacity, and the will of men willing to endure the impossible. When Patton's tanks roared forward, powered by fuel delivered against all odds, the Wehrmacht confronted a reality that textbooks had never imagined. The Red Ball Express symbolizes the convergence of human resilience, technology, and organizational daring. It reminds us that the machinery of war is only as effective as the people who operate it, and that logistics, often silent, seldom honored, can decisively shape the battlefield. In the end, the roads of northern France were not just conduits for fuel. They were veins of history, carrying the pulse of a war that would define the modern world. And in that pulse, the uncelebrated, relentless drivers ensured that victory was not just fought, but sustained. The war would continue, and so would the lessons of movement, endurance, and innovation. But for one blazing fortnight, the Red Ball Express proved that speed, daring, and human will could defy expectation and turn laughter into astonishment. Because in war, It is often the invisible engine that carries the heaviest weight of history.